Hello and welcome to Understanding ADMX Back Policies with Intune. I'm Kevin Kaminski. I'm a Windows and Devices MVP. I work with Big Hat Group. It's a company of mine. I do consulting, training, and a little bit of app development as well these days. Today what we're going to do is we're going to learn how we can take our group policies and move them across to the modern world. This is something I see very common when I'm trying to implement Intune and Windows 10 as a modern desktop with no connectivity to Active Directory or Configuration Manager. So why do we have this versus world, MDM versus group policy? Well, I think the messaging wasn't very clear on how things work in the different worlds. So Azure Active Directory does not have group policy. It relies on mobile device management to essentially provide that functionality. And that functionality is built into Windows 10, much like group policy is, using a variety of protocols and standards that are vendor neutral. So what Microsoft is doing here to manage the operating system isn't unique to Microsoft or Windows for that matter. It's more of an open set of standards that vendors can adhere to. So that gives you a variety of different options as to how you want to implement MDM to give you the settings you're looking for. So let's start with some terminology. So the first term is the Configuration Service Provider, or the CSP. This began in Windows Mobile 5, and it's basically a way of applying settings to the device. The CSP takes the settings and, being separate from group policy, it will apply settings to the device. Now, the challenge is that you got to make sure that you're not sending conflicting settings to the device through local policies or through, say, traditional domain join group policy, because these policies will conflict with each other. The Open Mobile Alliance Device Management Protocol, or OMADM for short, is used to send data between the client and server. That protocol contains what is referred to as SyncML, and SyncML is the XML-based configuration data that the client receives to understand how to configure the settings on the device. Then we get what's called the OMA URI. The OMA URI is yet another wacky term we have to understand, and that actually sits within the setting we're trying to configure. So in group policy, you sort of have the path of the setting. The OMA URI is very similar to that. It's where is this setting amongst all the other settings that the policy provider can configure. So these aren't specific settings in the slide, but you can see that there's a device path, which is per device settings, and there is a user path, so there are per user settings. Much less, but there still are per user settings. This is the location of the setting on the client, and you gotta remember that this is also case sensitive and data type sensitive. So the reason I'm doing this session is to also help you understand how you can more easily implement these settings, because it's very easy to input them incorrectly. So what I'm going to do now is talk about migrating GPUs, because that's often where we start with our settings. So when I'm looking at migrating, I'm going to download a tool to a test machine called MMAT. It's up on GitHub. I'm also going to make sure that I have the remote server administration tools installed, because that's a dependency of MMAT. And you also need to install, or I mean not install, log into the machine with a domain account. This ensures that the user group policy objects and the machine group policy objects are being targeted, as well as the user having enough access to actually audit the settings that are hitting the device so that you can produce this output below. So once you run MMAT, you know, you got to review that output, and you got to do it with a critical eye, because the biggest challenge I'm seeing right now is doing complicated security baselines with Intune. And if you've been paying attention to the announcements at Ignite, they have something to help you with that. What I'm looking at specifically here in this session is just setting custom settings that may not be in that baseline when it comes out. So some of the things you want to look at in the MMAT report before you go and migrate a setting is, does it exist? Does it need to come across? You know, so like if it's a domain firewall profile rule, a modern desktop isn't joined to the domain, so your modern or your domain profile doesn't really make any sense carrying that forward. Active Directory certificate services, if you're not joined to the domain, you're not using that. So you got to think about what actually applies in this new realm for your machine, because too often what I'm seeing is people not trying to cut down the settings, and they got to realize that migrating these settings is not a very automated process, and even looking for the mobile device baseline, security baselines for the modern desktop is only starting to take shape. So you have to make a lot of judgment calls on your part. So what I'm saying is take a very critical look at these settings and see if the out-of-box configuration is good enough with Windows, or if you really need to move that setting across to your modern desktop. Like, does it actually serve a security or business case? So, because in the end, the whole idea of going modern is to manage less, and less management is less money. So now what we're going to do is do a little bit of a demo with MMAT. Okay, here I have my test machine. It's all ready to go with the remote server administration tools installed. So if I check, the group policy management console is installed on this machine. Sometimes you might notice the edit group policy on the machine, and that's not what we need. That is actually part of Windows and edits your local group policies, and that's not what MMAT is going to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get this tool called MMAT. It's maintained on GitHub. So I go to the page on GitHub and I can hit clone or download and download a zip file of this tool. So I'm going to open the zip file when it downloads, and once I have that, I'm going to grab the folder that MMAT's in, and then take that and just put it on the root of my C drive. So now that I have that on the root of my C drive, what I can do is get out of Explorer and Edge and then open PowerShell. So I'm going to do it with an administrative command prompt. In the next little bit, I'll go to the MMAT folder. Once PowerShell gets itself initialized. And then the next little bit here is I'm going to set the execution policy to bypass and accept what I'm about to do because my content is not signed. And the next couple lines I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to just use my clipboard. So the next little piece here, just gonna make sure I can set my verbose preference for this to continue, just so I can get more logging information and let this thing run through. And the next piece I'm gonna do here is, oops, gotta use that, and run my script. So you can see here I get a lot of verbose output. I can see exactly what it's up to. This is a little bit better than running it in the default context, so I kind of recommend doing it this way. If you want, I can quickly show you what I ran in total just by dumping my clipboard off over to here. So you can see again, I set my execution policy, I set my verbosity preference, and then finally I'm running the invoke MDM Migration Analysis PS1 tool using the collect GPU reports argument as well as the run analysis tool argument. Now you can see right now that I have nothing really to look at other than the fact that the tool ran. So what I have to do is actually go back to that C drive MMAT folder, and you'll notice that there's an MDM migration analysis HTML file. That's the one we're going to look at. Just of reference, there's also an XML file with the output as well. Maybe you want to use some code to further manipulate the output of the tool, but for what I'm doing, I'm going to just open the HTML document. So when I open this HTML document, it gives me the option of sending the report to Microsoft so they know what kinds of settings you're trying to analyze and migrate. Gives me a little bit of information about the machine as well as the MMAT version I'm using. So yes, this does get updated. The first set of policies I have are security account policies. These ones I'm not interested in, but it does analyze everything that is targeting the machine. So if you want to filter this a little bit, you kind of have to filter what group policies are hitting the machine. The ones I'm actually interested in are these ADMX back policies for WinRM, and here you can see all the different policies with the group policy name. Then you can see whether or not they're enabled or disabled or whatever the value is, as well as the GPO that's applying the settings to the device in case you want to use that as a reference because maybe you're not sure of what's supplying the setting. It gives you the MDM CSP, which is important, but we're not going to dig into that just yet, as well as the MDM CSP setting URI, which is essentially where is this setting in Intune. And it's not in the GUI. It's essentially how we're going to program it in as a custom setting. So once we get to our second demo, this will all start to gel a little bit more and make sense. But essentially what I've got right now is a reference as to what is set, what are the values, how does this translate to MDM for the most part. Once you get more familiar with this, you might not use the tool I use in the second half as much, but this helped me fill in some blanks when I was making custom policies, so I'm going to show it to you anyway. So before we do that, I got to take you back to some slides and I'll introduce you to what we're going to do next. So we've got a report, we know the settings we want. So when we're creating the ADMX back policy, what we're going to do is we're going to take the setting, we're going to confirm the OMA URI, we're going to check the data type for the setting, and then define the data for the setting in the Intune console. This gets to be a little bit tricky if you use the Microsoft documentation and use their process. It's pretty wordy and you're looking at the ADMX files themselves to see how things are configured, and I found this to just be confusing and a lot of work. And when I did finally figure out how to use this information, I just found that there was still, I don't know, a lot of hidden pieces that lacked proper documentation that were not a part of this, you know, like paying attention to your data types. And your data types really play a huge role in what values you're using to set the setting. So it's kind of good to know about this, but I didn't find it very straightforward. What I did find straightforward is VMware, I think, saw the need for a tool to better define building these policies. So VMware's tool is built for AirWatch, and it really works well for AirWatch, but I found a way to kind of repurpose it for my needs with Intune. So I'm glad it's a publicly available tool. Like I wish Microsoft took this approach to make it more consumable by IT pros, but you know, it looks like at least somebody got the idea that this was really painful and helped build a better way to do it. So what I'm going to do in this next demo is I'm going to show you how I'm going to use VMware Policy Builder to build out that custom policy for Intune and basically optimize, I guess, that process of migrating the settings from MMAT over to your new environment. Okay, so what I have here is 3 windows open in Edge. First one is the MMAT output we generated in the previous lab. The second one is our policy builder, and I'll get into that in just a minute. And then finally, we have the Intune console where we're going to build out our policy and deploy it to devices. So what I'm going to do first is go back to Policy Builder and get myself logged in. So I have to agree to the terms. I have to click download, which is funny because we're not actually downloading it. We're logging into this tool since it's hosted. So I'm going to put in my VMware credentials. Grab my VMware password. And then log in. So how are we going to get started here? You can see here already it's got a lot of different settings that you can set with Intune. Or I shouldn't say Intune, MDM. So this was designed more for AirWatch users. So you got to take the output with a grain of salt because it wasn't really designed for you. But I'll show you why I find this interesting. So the first thing is we know we have to look for the policy CSP to set this setting if I go to the MMAT output. So in Policy Builder, I'm going to look for the policy CSP. So here's policy. I'm going to click the checkbox, go back to the top and select configure. So now it gives me a different set of settings that are in the policy CSP that I can configure. So what I'm specifically looking for, if I go back to the MMAT output, is I'm looking for allow basic authentication client under remote management. So let's first look for remote management. So going through this, what we're going to be doing is it's a device-based policy. So I should have pointed out that if I go back here, you notice this starts with device vendor. That means it's a vendor-based policy. So I'm going to skip the user configuration stuff because that doesn't apply. And then I'm going to go under my device and then config. And then I'm going to look for remote management. And I'm going to expand that out. And I can go and configure my settings. So if I go back, we're looking for allow basic authentication client, and we want it to be disabled. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So I click add, allow basic authentication client. It doesn't tell me much right now. If I put in something of a value, you notice on the right hand side I get a bunch of XML data, or the syncml that would be put into AirWatch. This not only contains the full OMA URI, which actually is in our MMAT output, but it also tells us the format in which the data has to be in. So it has to be in text. So what I've learned is if it's numeric and it's enabled and disabled, it would be a 0 or a 1. But because it's text plain, that means to disable it, I would type disabled in the value field, and it would show up as text plain disabled. So why is this important? Well, because what I've found is when I take what's in MMAT and try to make sense of it on the other side in Intune here, these custom policies basically allow you to easily make mistakes. So let's try to make the custom policy. So I have to hit device configuration, and I can go to device configuration profiles, and I can create a profile. So I create my custom profile. I'm just going to call it WinRM MVPDays. Change the platform to Windows 10 and later. Change the type to be a custom profile. And then we're going to have to put in our settings. So I can have all the WinRM settings in a policy. It's kind of interesting because with policies in Intune, there hasn't been a lot of talk about best practice, whether or not you should have lots of small policies with different settings, or if you should have bigger sets of settings in larger policies. As far as I know, there isn't, the same kind of performance issue as you get with group policy, but it's been a little vague as to what the best practice would be with these custom settings. So for this, I'm just going to add one setting to illustrate the demo. And so I click Add. I'm going to get the values to put in. So for this one, maybe what I'll do is if I look at what it's saying, I'll use the MDM setting, so allow basic authentication client to be the name. So maybe I want to say set allow basic authentication client to disabled. And the OMA URI I can find in either MMAT or the policy builder. So that means I could copy this whole line out from here, or I could copy the URI from policy builder as well. Please note that the OMA URI is case sensitive, and I would recommend validating it 100% before you put it in the tool, because troubleshooting this isn't always the best. The data type, that's important. We figured out it was a string value in Policy Builder, whereas MMAT does not tell you this, which I think is very important, especially if this is your first time trying to create custom policies. You need to know your data type. If you get the data type wrong, it's going to fail. So the data type is string and or text, string text, same thing. And what I'm going to put in here is I'm going to put in the value to disable it. So for example, if I look at how it is here, it's got a bunch of formatting around it. If I look at it here, it says just to put in disabled. But the reality is once you get familiar with this, to disable a setting, you want to put in disabled / and then close it off. So a little bit of a black art putting this all together, but this will get you your setting implemented. So once I put that in, I have my setting. I'm not going to do anything fancy with scope tags. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to create my setting. And now what I can do is, now that it's created, I can go and assign it to devices or users to go and test. But I won't do this because that is not the purpose of this demo here. It was just more to show you how you can program in the setting. So I hope you've learned a little bit about how to set up these policies. There are ways to troubleshoot them, but I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail because the problem I've found is when these policies, these custom policies in Intune get applied, if they're not applied with the correct data type, correct value, you know, or the wrong OMA URI, getting the feedback to know what you messed up, I find is very lacking in the solution. The Intune console sometimes tells you that something's wrong, but that's about as granular as the reporting gets. There is an MDM report log you can launch on the client manually, but that that report doesn't really help you a lot with troubleshooting bad policies. It more or less shows you whether or not the client is sees it and can apply it. I would say Event Viewer is your best bet. There is the device management, enterprise device management log in Windows, which is for the MDM provider, so it's not Intune specific. But if you look in that log and you send a bad policy to a device, you will see a lot of errors. However, my trouble is you won't see errors with meaningful troubleshooting information. You'll just know that you have a problem and it's not working. And so I'm hoping this experience gets better, either through more settings being natively supported in the Intune GUI, or through better troubleshooting mechanisms so that we can know when we send out these policies, we're actually getting the feedback to remediate the issue without just being told that it didn't work. So thanks. I really hope you learned something about it. I would say, you know, if you can, try to keep it simple with the modern desktop. I know we have to deal with security baselines like CIS, and it's becoming better. The story is becoming better. There is work being done to make modern security baselines for modern desktops from different sources. So expect that to improve, but where you can't get what you're looking for out of that feature, you know, there is custom policies, but I would say custom policies is something you shouldn't go deep into unless you really need those settings, because it is a very time-consuming effort. This is not like group policy where we have all these nicely designed tools and processes to get our group policy environment up to snuff. So with modern desktop, yeah, it's still a lot of manual process and just understanding how the data needs to be put together, and yeah, we can just only expect it to get better from here. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you hopefully another MVPDays sometime soon. Thanks.